This point. So,
Well, good morning, my friends. Sadly, I am pre-recording this sermon for you because COVID has come back to the Kirkpatrick household. Fortunately, only one of the kids has gotten it so far, and it's been very mild, so we're blessed in that way. But I would appreciate your prayers and just know that we're missing being able to be with you this morning. We're going to continue our study in Matthew. We're going to be in Matthew 23 today, which is on page 793. And we're going to be honing in on what Jesus talks about when he begins to talk about hypocrisy. How do we solve the problem of hypocrisy? This chapter is pretty intense. One of the shepherds came to me this week and said, I've been reading ahead. How in the world are you going to make this Sunday's sermon something positive? I was like, first of all, I didn't realize that was an expectation. In reality, Jesus is going to be intense here, but we're going to end someplace really, really positive. We're just going to have to chew through the text to get there. So we're going to read a good chunk of Matthew 23 this morning, and then I'm going to help process some of what Jesus is doing underneath the text, and then to help us see how we apply it. Let's read Matthew 23. We're going to start in verse 13. Just know that in the background here, Jesus is talking to his disciples and the crowds who have been listening, and now he's going to turn his attention to kind of a scathing message to the Pharisees and the religious leaders. And in the NLT, it's going to say, what sorrow awaits you? But the word there is woe, which is kind of a projecting bad things are coming for you. So I'm going to use that language as we read through it. So here we go. Woe to you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You won't go in yourselves, and you don't let others enter either. What sorrow awaits you? You teachers of religious law and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cross land and sea to make one convert and then turn that person into twice the child of hell that you yourselves are. Blind guides, woe to you, for you say it means nothing to swear by God's temple, but that it's binding to swear by the gold in the temple. Blind fools, which is more important, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? And you say that to swear by the altar is not binding, but to swear by the gifts on the altar is binding. How? Blind! Which is more important, the gift on the altar or the altar that makes the gift sacred? When you swear by the altar, you're swearing by it and by everything on it. And when you swear by the temple, you're swearing by it and by God who lives in it. And when you swear by heaven, you're swearing by the throne of God and by God who sits on the throne. Woe to you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you're careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens. But you ignore the more important aspects of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the more important things. Blind guides! You strain your water so you won't accidentally swallow a gnat, but you swallow a camel. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees? Hypocrites! You are so careful to clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you're filthy, full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee! First, wash the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will become clean too. Woe to you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you're like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity. Outwardly, you look like righteous people, but inwardly your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build tombs for the prophets your ancestors killed, and you decorate the monuments of the godly people your ancestors destroyed. Then you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would never have joined them in killing the prophets. But in saying that, you testify against yourselves that you are indeed the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead and finish what your ancestors started. Snakes, sons of vipers, how will you escape the judgment of hell? Therefore, I am sending you prophets and wise men and teachers of religious law. But you will kill some by crucifixion. You will flog others with whips in your synagogues, chasing them from city to city. As a result, you will be held responsible for the murder of all godly people of all time, from the murder of righteous Abel to the murder of Zechariah, son of Bechiah, whom you killed in the temple between the sanctuary and the altar. I tell you the truth, this judgment will fall on this very generation. Now, Jesus is angry. He's intense here. It's a side of Jesus that we've only seen hinted at, but now is coming out full bore. Let's look at some of the things that Jesus says as he calls out their hypocrisy. The first thing that Jesus calls out, he says in verse 13, "Woe to you, hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You don't go in yourselves, and you don't let others enter either." Now, I want to pause here for a second because I've heard so many people kind of jump the shark here. And if you miss what Jesus says here, you kind of miss the whole thing, especially what comes next. When Jesus says, you refuse to enter the kingdom of heaven, I've heard lots of people talk about this as saying, you're not going to heaven and you're not letting other people go to heaven either. But Jesus doesn't say that, does he? We've been reading Matthew in its context. Jesus says you refuse to enter the kingdom of heaven. And since we've been doing this one chapter at a time, we've seen how Jesus has developed the idea of the kingdom of heaven. And the kingdom of heaven is not somewhere you go, it's something you participate in. So Jesus says, woe to you, because you're refusing to enter the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is the reign of God, the reign of heaven. It's heaven on earth. There's the Lord's Prayer. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That is the kingdom of heaven. It's how we treat one another and how we interact with God. And it's not something you wait for. Jesus is telling these religious leaders, I have been inviting you, not just me, but the text, the Torah, has been inviting you into the kingdom of heaven. And you refuse to enter. You refuse to treat people in the way that God would have you treat one another. And you refuse to honor God the way that God would have you honor him. And so because of that, you're refusing to enter the kingdom of heaven. And then through your teaching and leadership, you're slamming the door and refusing to let your followers enter as well. He's basically saying, if you leaders would just follow me, all of Israel would enter the kingdom of heaven together. But you religious leaders are keeping them out. So what kind of judgment is going to come on a person who does that? And so then, with that in mind, it's not about later, it's about the kingdom of heaven now. He turns and says, what sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cross land and sea to make one convert. To convert someone to Judaism is to go and find them, to convince them that Yahweh is the God of everything, the only God. You should come, and then you must be circumcised. This is not a small task to make a convert if you're Jewish. You cross land and sea to make a single convert, and then you turn that person into twice the child of hell you are. Now, pause here, because if you heard kingdom of heaven as eternity, then you're going to hear twice the son of hell as eternity. The word hell here, if you look in your footnote, is actually the word Gehenna. And Gehenna is kind of a packed term. So let's take just a second. I think this will be interesting. Gehenna is actually, it's the Greek version of a Hebrew place, Gehinnom, the Valley of Hinnom. And the Valley of Hinnom is outside of Jerusalem, and it's this huge garbage dump. It's nasty. It didn't just become a garbage dump because they needed somewhere to put their trash. It became a garbage dump because back in the Old Testament, at one point, the people of Israel have apostatized. They began worshiping the false god Molech. And Molech is a god that demands child sacrifice. So they're taking their babies, and there's these, we found these idols that have their arms out. You would build a fire inside of it, and you place your firstborn child on the arms of this idol, and they die. A horrific death. God judges those people for doing so. And when reform happens and those idols are finally smashed, and those places of worship are torn down, this valley of Gehenna, that's the place where they come in and they smash it and they say, this is an abomination, it is all defiled, it is unclean. And so they turn that unclean valley into a trash heap. Now, fast forward to the prophet Jeremiah, who tells Israel, because of your corruption, or I'm sorry, at this point it's Judah, but because of your corruption, God is going to punish you, and the army that will come in and take you away, they're going to kill so many of you because of your idolatry and corruption. They're not even going to give you a proper burial. They're going to take your bodies and they're going to throw them on the trash heap of Gehenna. So Jesus is now standing in Jerusalem once again in a corrupt religious system, and he tells these people, you're going to win a single convert. But when you win that convert, because of the thing you were winning them to, the way you were teaching them about God, you were turning them into twice the son of Gehenna that you are. That there's a time coming when all of this is coming down. And just like Jeremiah prophesied, your bodies won't even get a proper burial. They'll get thrown into that pile of trash. To use modern language, it's really like Jesus saying, you're participating in the dumpster fire, and every convert you get, you're winning them to the dumpster fire. This whole thing is a dumpster fire, and this whole religious system is coming down. Whew. He's saying this in the temple. Blind guides what sorrow awaits you. And then he talks about swearing. Now, Jesus has talked about swearing back in Matthew chapter 5, verse 33, where he says to his disciples, let your yes be yes and your no be no. What is he saying? Be consistent. Tell the truth. Don't lie, and speak the truth in love. That's what Christians are called to do. There's no need to promise or to swear if you are a person of integrity. But these people, they found ways to swear and not even have to mean it. Huh, cross my fingers. Doesn't count. Swore by this, not by that. Oh, I guess I'm out of it. He says you're fundamentally untrustworthy. And you're supposed to be the religious leaders. And you've taught people, the entire religious system has become untrustworthy because of your hypocrisy. Pause here for a second. Can I tell you, I was having a conversation with a friend recently who said, until coming to Adams, I've never been a person who's willing to go to church because when I look at church people, all I see are hypocrites. When the religious people and the religious system, when churches themselves become so full of hypocrisy, their very word, what they say they believe or what they say is true, can't even be trusted. It's over. Okay. And then Jesus moves on and he starts to talk about tithing. He says, woe to you, you hypocrites, for you're careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens. Herb gardens? I don't know. You figure it out. But they're tithing the tiniest bit. But you ignore the more important aspects of the law: justice, mercy, and faith. You should tithe, yes, but don't neglect the more important things. Blind guides. You strain out your water so you won't accidentally swallow a gnat, but you swallow a camel. All right, now this is hilarious if you're Jewish, but since most of us aren't, let me explain this metaphor he just used, okay? The camel is the tiniest of all the unclean animals the Israelites are not allowed to eat, and the camel is the largest, okay? So gnat, teeny tiny, camel, humongous. And he's saying, you strain your water so that, and they would strain their water so that not a gnat could get through and they could drink the water and not be defiled. He says, but you're swallowing a camel. When he talks about tithing, tithing is meant for a purpose. It still is for us as well. Tithing does several things. Number one, it funds the religious system, okay? Like we can do this stuff. We have a building and ministers and we can get together and do fun things and worship things and gatherings like with Dewey last week, whatever, because we tithe. But that's not even the most important thing, not even close. On top of funding the religious system, tithing also filled up the storehouses of the temple so that when people in the Israelite community had need, they could go to the temple and say, I'm hungry, and they could pull out of the tithing stores and they could give to those in need. We do the same thing here. We help our brothers and sisters in our church family who have monetary needs. We help people in the community as well. But even that isn't the only point. You see, when we give collectively, be it for the religious system or to set things aside so we can help those in need, the whole point is to teach us personal generosity. God has blessed me, and so I'm going to bless the church family, and I'm going to bless those in need in our community. That's the point. It is a system meant to teach us something specific. But Jesus tells these teachers of religious law, you've totally missed it. Oh, you're measuring out the 10th of your dill and the 10th of your mint and the 10th of whatever you can grow. Okay, congratulations. But then you're walking past the poor on the way into the temple. You don't even notice them. People are hurting and sick and in need. And you're like, look at me. I measured out my 10th, put it in the storehouse. But you don't care about the people. You've strained out the gnat. You've got the smallest check mark correct. But you're gorging yourself on this unclean behavior because the whole point is supposed to be about people, about loving each other and about compassion. And because of that, trouble is coming. Woe to you. Then he moves on from that metaphor to another metaphor. He says, What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're careful to clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you're filthy, full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first wash the inside of the cup and the dish, then the outside will become clean too. Okay, so I've been enjoying this coffee as I teach, and I'm drinking out of this paper cup because I do not want to drink out of this metal cup. See, this paper cup is brand new, came out of the sleeve today. This metal cup has been sitting on my desk for a month. Ew. Now, if you're just drinking coffee, maybe it's not that gross, but I like a good amount of heavy cream in my coffee. Heavy cream is, well, it doesn't have a great shelf life if you leave it outside. And so you can imagine if I had some coffee at the bottom of this and it's been sitting on my desk for a month, just exactly what it might look like on the inside. Now imagine, since I don't want some coffee to kind of keep me focused as I go through this sermon, and I grab the cup that's been sitting on my desk and I go, oh, that's gross, I should probably wash it. And I get a rag and some soap and I really give it a good polishing, okay? And I wash the top and the bottom so there's nothing on it. I polish it up so that logo looks cool. And then I go and I turn the Keurig on and put the K-Pod in and I fill it up. And I get my heavy cream, I pour it in, I stir it all together. All I'm doing is mixing in all that mold, that nastiness, those germs, those bacteria. I'm just mixing it into the new coffee. And I'm like, I start to drink and you go, oh, Aaron, don't touch that. Well, why not? That cup's disgusting. No, it isn't. I just cleaned it. Look how nice it looks. It would be absurd, wouldn't it? In fact, if I did that, if I started drinking out of it, you go, number one, I'm going to go ahead and leave because you're disgusting. And number two, you should probably go find somewhere to throw up because you're about to get really sick. This is what Jesus is saying, like your whole religious practice. You made the outside look so good, but on the inside, you're just nasty. You're sickening. Now you can see how when he says, whoa, trouble is coming. Bad things are going to happen to this whole religious system because of these religious leaders. Can you see now why the trouble is coming? Why destruction is inevitable? Because when the religious system becomes this corrupted and polluted, it looks great on the outside, but on the inside, it is corrupt and rotten to the core. How can it do anything but collapse? When the religious system has fallen out of step with righteousness towards God, being in right relationship with Him, which is fundamentally shown by being in right relationship with His children. When that is broken down, how can the system do anything other than collapse? Jesus will then turn and begin describing their religious system and their behavior as whitewashed tombs. So you look great on the outside, you look like, but on the inside, you're full of dead people's bodies. I mean, he just keeps getting more and more extreme with his metaphor. The challenge of religion, one of the big challenges of religion, is that religion is always supposed to point you to something else. All of our religious practice points to something else. It's the thing behind the thing. Okay, when we take communion, there is a ritual that happens, but it's pointing to Jesus, his death. It's a symbol. All of our practices, when we baptize, it's a symbol of connecting to the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus. All of religious practice is supposed to be getting you to do specific things that point to a bigger reality on the other side of that practice. But the big challenge of religion is that it always tends to make the thing about itself, to make the religious practice the ends. It becomes a thing to be focused on instead of pointing to the greater thing on the other side. It's possible to be a completely committed religious Christian, and Jesus hasn't even touched your heart. You can be a religious practice or a practicing religious person in the Christian system and not a Jesus follower. This is the hard truth of what Jesus has been telling us for all this time, and it should be absolutely terrifying. When we talked about hypocrisy, when we talked about being a Pharisee, years ago we did a series called The Unsaved Christian. It made a whole bunch of people uncomfortable. Oh, why are you saying this? I want to know that I'm saved. If it's just about the practice, if that's the thing, then you miss the point. At least that's what Jesus tells the Pharisees here. What sorrow awaits you, you hypocrites? You build tombs for the prophets your ancestors killed, and you decorate the monuments of the godly people your ancestors destroyed. Then you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would never have joined them in killing the prophets. But in saying that, you testify against yourselves that you are indeed the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead and finish what you started, or what your ancestors started. Snakes, sons of vipers, how will you escape the judgment of Gehenna? How will you escape the judgment that Jeremiah prophesied? Now, Jesus is going to talk about the destruction of the temple in the next chapter. I know many of you have told me you're looking forward to that with lots of questions, but I would suggest that I think Jesus is already talking about the destruction of the temple right here. When a system becomes this corrupt and this rotten from the inside, it is inevitable that it will collapse. I told you we're going to get somewhere positive, but you're going to have to wait another minute. At some point, we Christians need to be honest enough with ourselves to look inwardly and to actually answer the question, are we guilty of the things that Jesus is talking about here? Are we participants in a system that has become so rotten from the inside that it inevitably must fall? When a religious system has become this self-serving, this self-centered, instead of being focused on God and others, when our religious practice becomes about us, it's only a matter of time until the whole thing must come down. Because hypocrisy is self-defeating. For years, you know this is true, that what the world has been saying about the church, I'm talking the Western church, okay? I don't just mean our congregation, I mean the church, big C. What the world has been saying about the church is, it's full of hypocrites. It's totally hypocritical. And our reaction for a long time has been either, one, to ignore them because what would they know? They're worldly lost people. Or number two, to come up with slogans or sayings that are fairly dismissive. I would suggest to you that the people who called us hypocrites were right. And that at some point, when a system becomes corrupted and hypocritical for long enough, the whole thing will inevitably collapse. And that is what we have seen over the last 50 years. All right, this is weird, but I'm breaking in here. It's like 3 hours after I recorded what you were just watching. And normally on a Sunday, I would have seen when I said that the church has become corrupt and is collapsing in on itself, I would have seen your face go, and I would have known that I needed to give an example or clarify. Instead, I had to listen to me preach it, edit it, and then I went, hold on a second, and realized I still have a little more to say to prove this case to you. When Jesus tells the Pharisees that their system is corrupt, he gives examples, and so I need to do the same. How many times over the last several decades have you heard about a church or even a denomination, a movement of churches who have been caught up in sex abuse scandals or child abuse scandals, or worst of all, a combination of the two? How many times have we seen churches or denominations split over ever shrinking things? Like the things that we split over, our disagreements got smaller and smaller, yet we still fractured. Jesus says we are to be known for our love for one another. Instead, we turned around and fought what we called worship wars. We said that other Christians are going to hell for small disagreements. Instead of us being a movement of people that were known for following the ethics of Jesus, so much of the culture of the Western church has been known by outsiders as being vitriolic or angry or petty. And as we've seen our cultural relevance slip, we've also then seen the Western church turn around and grab on tighter and tighter to political power, trying to stay relevant. All of these things have hurt individuals. And so when the outsider says, I see what Jesus taught in the Bible, but when I look at what I know about church, about Christians, they don't seem to match. I think they're right. I think they're obviously right. That doesn't mean that individuals haven't been consistently following Jesus or that whole churches haven't had the goals of Jesus in mind. In fact, we have, I think, myself included, I was born in the church. I've been a member of the Church of Christ my whole life. I've never wanted anything other than to follow Jesus. And yet I found myself wrapped up in these very same things. It's a sobering thought that when Jesus called out the Pharisees here, they believed they were following God's will. You can follow God's will, or at least feel like you're following God's will, and not be following the way of Jesus. That's hard. Thank you for letting me interrupt myself. Now let's move towards the good news. You see, Matthew 23 is all about the problem of hypocrisy. And he calls out those religious leaders. And the question is, how do we break the cycle? See, chapter 23 of Matthew is really, really bad news, which is why that shepherd asked, how in the world can you make this thing positive? And here's the answer. Here's where it gets positive. Matthew 23 is really bad news if you are a religious hypocrite. But it's really good news if you're a Jesus follower. Religious hypocrisy is cyclical. It inevitably comes up periodically, but the people of God always have the opportunity to turn back towards Jesus. You see, Jesus is the antidote for religious hypocrisy. I think Matthew 23 sits on the opposite side of the gospel from Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount describes what a righteous life looks like when you follow the way of Jesus. Matthew 23 describes what a religious system looks like when it has betrayed the way of Jesus. So if you are comfortable in a religious system that is corrupted, then this is really bad news because the whole thing's coming down. But if you are a Jesus follower, this is great news because Jesus's way was so attractive to the world that sees the hypocrisy of the religious system. So it's easy to get weighed down in this current moment and to go, the churches are dying, they are. The Christendom is collapsing, it already has. And people don't want anything to do with Jesus. They actually do. What they don't want anything to do with is a religious system that has betrayed them and has been hypocritical for decades. But this is not the way of Jesus. This is actually antithetical. The truth about Jesus is that people are desperate for his way of life, that his way of life actually is the best way, and that when his people gather together and live out his way together, it brings the world to a place of flourishing. If you're invested in the corrupt religious system, this is terrible news. And as we've seen churches die, those of us who grew up in churches and love it, our hearts break. Oh, but I love this thing. I was a part of this thing. I don't want to see it die. But if the heart of what was built was corrupted or became broken in a fundamental way, then Jesus followers should celebrate the old going away so that this new righteous way might be reinvigorated. I need to make sure I'm crystal clear here. If the critique of the outsider has been correct, that Christianity, at least in a Western expression of Christianity, became corrupted by the culture, by an external righteousness, by whatever, right? I'm not talking about every individual. I'm talking about the system as a whole. If it really was that hypocritical that the entire world could see it, of course, the people who wouldn't see it are the insiders. If that thing goes away, then the best news in the world is that Jesus's way is reemerging from the ashes. The world needs Jesus and his way. The world does not need yet another corrupted religious system. Matthew 23 is bad news for the corrupt system. It's going to die. It's great news for everybody who has seen that for the hypocrisy it is, because when Christians live out the way of Jesus in the world around us, and we actually live in Jesus's way, we care less about the Christendom stuff and more about Christ. When we live out that way, guess what happens? People are desperate to be a part of it. They're eager to run into the kingdom. That is amazing news. Who followed Jesus? We've said this 100 times. Hear it again. Who were the crowds? The sick, the poor, the oppressed, the overlooked. They were helpless and harassed, like sheep without a shepherd. That's who came to Jesus. The religious system had failed them because it was all built on hypocrisy, and it was made to make a few people rich and to make a few people look good. But Jesus came and said, I am here. My kingdom is for everybody else. And church, if we're a church that loves Jesus, then Matthew 23 should not be bad news for us. It should be great news, because the way of Jesus will lead to people coming to salvation. So what do we do with the problem of religious hypocrisy? How do we solve it? How do we make sure that we don't fall into this way of life? Three phrases come to mind. I kind of love all three. The first one, I am a hypocrite saved by grace. I am a hypocrite and I am saved by grace. And so are you, and so can everybody be. But that doesn't mean I stay a hypocrite. Once I'm saved by grace, now I've moved into something new. As Paul would say, should we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. I don't have to stay a hypocrite. The way of Jesus is not the way of hypocrisy. So yes, I am a hypocrite, a recovering hypocrite. And I am now called to do everything in my power not to be a hypocrite anymore. So I'm a hypocrite saved by grace, but it's not an excuse. It's a confession. You see the difference there. And then number two, I love this phrase, the church is full of hypocrites and it could use one more. When I talk to somebody who is not a follower of Jesus, and they're like, well, the church is hypocritical. Well, the church is full of hypocrites. Again, confessing repentant hypocrites. But it could really use one more. And then third, I want to ask, is the church really full of hypocrites? Must our church be full of hypocrites? The way of Jesus is the way of integrity. It is the way of consistency. It is the way of proactive love. Hypocrisy, as Jesus describes it here, hypocrisy is not that you fail or that you sin. The way of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, as we saw, it doesn't actually teach us how never to sin. It teaches us how to love each other enough to make it right when we do sin against one another. It teaches us how to live in peace. And if Jesus' system is all about proactive reconciliation and proactive love, learning to serve one another and put one another's needs above our own, if that's really the way of Jesus, then why must we be hypocrites? I don't think that we have to be. There's no reason the church has to be full of hypocrites. When people say your church is full of hypocrites, I would say, I don't think it is. And if it is, then we need to fix it. Saying the church is full of hypocrites, so I guess we're just going to stay that way, is a cop-out that is not the way of Jesus. When we learn to follow Jesus as his disciples, the more closely we learn to follow him, the less hypocritical we become. And if we understand that we will fail, and if we make it right when we do fail, we've actually moved out of hypocrisy and into integrity. It is not hypocrisy to believe that this is the right thing to do and then to make mistakes and miss the mark. It is hypocrisy to say this is the way we are supposed to live. This is where the mark is. I'm not even going to try to hit it, but it's okay. I don't have to worry about it. That is hypocrisy. In a church full of people who see the way of Jesus and say we are committed to following it, when we miss the mark, but we work towards reconciliation, that is not hypocrisy. That is moral consistency. That is integrity. And that is a wonderful witness to the world around us. So here's my hope for our church as we wrap up. My hope for our church is that we will move ever closer into the way of Jesus, that we can read Matthew 23 with no fear, because we are not a religiously hypocritical people. We are people who love Jesus and love each other. And we are constantly seeking to be in right relationship with God and with one another. And if that is the case, if we are truly following the way of Jesus, we do not need to worry or fear Jesus's proclamation of the woes to the religious hypocrites, because we will not be in that group. Instead, we will be in the group of disciples whom Jesus is teaching, live like me, and you don't have to worry about this. That is what I believe we've been seeing in our church, and my prayer is we will see it more and more. May we be a people who sit in Jesus' group of disciples, welcoming others in, even as the systems of our world are corrupted and crumble around us. May we be a place of hope in a world that is lost. May we be a place of peace in a world that is chaotic. At some point in the sermon, you may have looked at yourself and said, wow, I really am actually being a hypocrite. I have focused too much on the religion and not enough on the relationship. And if that's who you are, if you're one of those people, join the club and know that you're in a safe place. We love you. We would love to pray with you or pray for you. We'd love to walk with you and help you journey with integrity into the way of Jesus. If we can love you or help you on your journey, you can come talk to one of our shepherds as we stand and as we sing.